Hi everybody, I'm Professor Andrew Knight from the University of Winchester Centre for Animal Welfare, and I'm a cat and dog veterinarian with many years of experience in general small animal practice. And I'm going to be talking about vegan diets for cats and dogs. Should cats and dogs go vegan?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for joining us for the second lecture in the 2022 Darwin College Lecture Series. Special thanks to those of you who've braved the cold and sort of nearing to post-pandemic, we hope, and coming and joining us in person. But also, we're really grateful to those of you who are joining us online. You're all very welcome. As you know, of course, our focus for 2022 is on food. And last week, we heard just how much difference it makes to our carbon footprint, what we choose to eat, and how relatively small changes in our diet can have a significant impact on the environment that we live in and that we depend on. This week, we're not going to focus on our own diet, but that of our pets, as you know from the title. Interestingly, I have discovered, which I didn't know, that there are an enormous number of pets, and which I did know, of course, but over 45% of households in the UK have a pet, and that has been stable for the last 20 years or so, but in the last 18 months, it's risen to over 60% for reasons we can all imagine, to do with the pandemic and to do with working from home and emotional losses in other ways that are gained by having a pet. There are over 30 million, I gather, pets in the UK, of which 12 million are dogs and 12 million are cats. So cats and dogs feature large. And we spend over £6 billion a year on these pets, most of it on their food. So what we feed them will have a profound impact on budgets, but also on the environment, both for the pet's environment and our own. And therefore it seems really timely and very appropriate in this series to have our guest speaker to speak on the subject, the question, should cats and dogs go vegan? It's a real pleasure to welcome and introduce our speaker, Andrew Knight, to deliver this to deliver this Darwin College lecture. He's a professor of animal welfare and ethics at the University of Winchester and the founding director of that university's Centre for Animal Welfare. He's also an adjunct professor in the School of Environmental Science at Griffith University in Queensland, his home country. For many years, Andrew was, however, a practicing vet in London and elsewhere, and he was the director of the Clinical Schools Laboratory at one of the world's largest veterinary schools, which, believe it or not, is in St. Kitts in the Caribbean. He's been widely recognized for his work on animal ethics and generally, as a vet, he received the Society of Veterinary Medical Ethics Shoma Award, the Humane Society Veterinary Medical Association Humane Achievement Award, and is a fellow of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. He's worked regularly with a whole series of animal charities, animal welfare charities, and his research and knowledge are widely promoted through his public engagement efforts, his YouTube videos, and many other activities that he performs in addition to his fascinating research. So, without further ado from me, it is a great pleasure. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Knight onto the stage to give us his lecture.
Thank you very much indeed, everybody, and Dr. Rance for that kind invitation and for the hospitality at Darwin College here, and a big welcome also to those of you joining online. After nearly 2 years of giving remote lectures, I must say it's a pleasure to actually be talking to people in person again. It's actually the first time I've done this, and so for your sakes and mine, I hope I can remember how to do this. So, should cats and dogs go vegan? On the face of it, it seems outrageous to think that cats or dogs could be maintained on vegan diets. They're obviously carnivores, or at least omnivores in the case of dogs. We know that they have evolved from carnivorous species. Dogs, for example, were domesticated some 20 to 40,000 years ago from wolves that roamed around the landscape following our hunter-gatherer ancestors as we hunted large game animals and foraged root vegetables, berries, other plant materials and so on. The more confident wolves would, and the more friendly wolves would approach more closely to the human campfires and sometimes receive scraps from us. They started to follow our hunting parties, started to work a little bit more collaboratively and cooperatively with the early human hunter-gatherer bands. They started to understand human communication more. They're virtually the only species, one of the very few that understands what it means to point. And over time, those friendlier wolf hybrids that were adopted by early human hunter-gatherer bands and developed mutations to be able to subsist and gain nutritional benefit on things like cooked root vegetables and other scraps from human campfires did better than the wolves that didn't. And over time, these animals changed from wolves to domesticated dogs, which are able to derive nutritional benefit from a much more diverse range of foodstuffs, scraps from early human campfires, cooked starchy root vegetables and so on. And they became domesticated dogs. Cats have had quite a different history. They've been domesticated for a shorter period of time, more like about 8,000 years, and their role was a different one. They were primarily tasked with guarding the grain stores in places like ancient Egypt and around the Mediterranean and the Fertile Crescent where the agrarian societies first began. So they have not been co-evolving with humans for as long, and their role has been different, and they have not changed their physiology to be able to subsist on more of a diet of scraps from human campfires. So they remain very much obligate carnivores, meaning that in their natural environments they do need to hunt and kill a variety of small mammals, birds and insects because they're not able to obtain enough nutritional benefit from the plant-based material that they would naturally consume. And of course, cats and dogs do naturally consume some plant-based material, primarily from the gastrointestinal tracts of prey animals, or I should say wolves and dogs. So that is the history, but today there's been a sea change in the lifestyles of cat and dog guardians. Many people are adopting more plant-based lifestyles because of concerns about these sorts of mega trends. The first one is animal ethics. We are now killing around the world each year close to 80 billion land animals and around about 1 to 3 trillion fish. So the land animals alone is 10 times the human population of the planet, and we kill those animals each year. And you can have a discussion about the ethics of killing animals which are sentient animals and have the capacity for a life fulfilling their own interests and desires. Most of those are killed, of course, at a very premature stage of life. But on top of that, we know that 90% or so of these animals are intensively farmed in environments where they have very little space. They're typically relatively barren environments. They have high stocking densities. They're unable to perform many of their highly motivated natural behavioural urges and needs. They have a range of surgical alterations inflicted on them, which are painful in the short term and the longer term, such as tail docking, castration, and other surgical procedures, and too often, unfortunately, without painkillers because it's cheaper not to provide those. Many people are increasingly concerned about these issues. And then there's the issues of food justice. There is inequitable access to food resources around the world. We know that the consumption of grain per person per year varies widely between about 200 kilograms per person in places like India, where there's very little margin for wastage of that, up to about 800 kilograms per person in places like Canada and the US, where most of that grain is actually consumed indirectly in the form of beef, milk, and other livestock products. Because when we convert things like a plant protein into animal protein, most of the protein is lost in the conversion process. Most of the protein is actually used to support the bodily functions of livestock animals, and relatively little is left over for the generation of useful products such as mussels, milk, and eggs. So the food conversion ratios can be as poor as 10 to 1 in the case of beef cattle, improving somewhat through the 6s and 7s and 5s as we pass through animals like sheep and pigs, improving still further to around about 3 to 1 in the case of intensively farmed chickens, maybe reaching 2 to 1 or slightly better in the case of intensively farmed fish. But it's never 1 to 1. There's always a massive loss of food energy in the conversion from plant protein to animal protein. And at the same time, we know that despite all this overconsumption of grain in wealthy nations such as Canada and the US, because of feeding most of that grain to livestock animals, hunger and malnutrition around the world is on the increase. There used to be, I think, about 825 million people worldwide back around about 20 plus years ago. Now it's more than 1 billion people around the world and rising despite more than 20 years of so-called progress. The environmental issues have been covered, I think, quite considerably by the previous speaker and by very many studies to date. Around about 2/3 of the Earth's ice-free land surface is given over to food production. Around about 80% of that is used in livestock production, whether growing feed crops of feeding to livestock or grazing livestock animals. And yet that 80% of agricultural land produces about 18% of calories that we consume. So yes, it produces food for us, but it's a very inefficient way of doing that, and it consumes enormous amounts of land, contributes to deforestation, the pollution of waterways because of the large amounts of manure that are produced. I was recently fortunate enough to spend a year on secondment in New Zealand, the famous home of the Lord of the Rings movies, this beautiful, pristine country. But sadly, despite that lovely image, the government has recently declared that the only rivers that are still safe to swim in New Zealand are the rivers on the western side of the South Island of New Zealand, because all the rest across the country have been basically contaminated by too much manure runoff from the dairy farming industry, which is quite big in New Zealand. So there is a lot of environmental damage and destruction of forests which have been cleared for livestock grazing and the growing of feed crops. And we know about the health concerns as well. Developing nations are afflicted by diseases of malnutrition, whereas here in the wealthy westernised nations we have diseases of overnutrition. And we know that the typical Western diet, which is high in saturated fat, salt and sugar, and too many livestock products, have been accompanied by an epidemic, essentially, of people being overweight, obese, having cardiovascular problems, having strokes, also a variety of cancers, and sequelae such as diabetes. These problems are caused by our overly consumptive dependence upon livestock products, as well as too much saturated fat, salt and sugar. So because of these sorts of concerns and the increasing awareness of these sorts of issues amongst many people, there has been quite a sea change going on in the food sector. The growth in vegan products and plant-based products in the food sector is the fastest growing section of the food sector today. Within the pet food sector, people are now developing alternatives to conventional meat-based pet foods as well to satisfy the growing interests and demands of consumers who are changing their own lifestyles and interested in doing the same for their pets. And these sorts of alternatives are being developed. There's even talk of intensively farming insects, which are quite high in protein actually, and using them as a protein source. This market is growing so rapidly that it was recently valued, as you can see, as being worth nearly $9 billion and estimated to be growing 7.7 compounded annual growth rate per year, to be expected to be worth $16 billion by 2028. So a very rapidly growing sector. But should this actually be happening? Because there have been critics that have prominently criticised certainly vegan, pet foods, and vegans' diets are the most developed of the alternatives that are coming on stream. Things like in vitro meat and insects aren't very developed yet. Loeb is a reporter for one of the leading veterinary journals, and he has made these sorts of claims. He cited the almost insurmountable challenges of anyone attempting to shoehorn dogs and cats onto a vegan dietary system, and said it's very clear that feeding vegan diets to dogs is not recommended. And what about cats? He says that it goes further, actually. Someone that feeds their cats a vegan diet could be committing a crime under the Animal Welfare Act. And why is that? It's because the Animal Welfare Act requires us to take care of the basic needs of animals, including the need to provide them with a nutritious diet. Many veterinarians, and indeed the British Veterinary Association, agree with that, stating this: cats are obligate carnivores, they shouldn't be fed a vegetarian or a vegan diet. But if you go searching the books in the field, popular books or the internet, you find many cases of cats and dogs apparently doing well on vegan diets, despite the sorts of concerns we've just seen raised. You can go as far back as finding there's some old black and white photos of an African lioness who apparently was touring India with an Indian guru about 100 years ago. More recently, in the 1950s, we had the famous case of Little Tyke, the African lioness who was raised on an animal sanctuary in California with an orphaned lamb, a deer and a swan, all of whom became her firm friends. And she hadn't been raised with other lionesses or lions, roaming the plains of Africa, hunting gnus, gazelles, giraffes, impalas and so on, and she didn't associate other animals as being food. And so she refused to eat any meat. Now, the Westbos, this kindly couple, were made very worried by their veterinarian's concerns that if she didn't eat meat, she would become very ill. And so they posted a $1,000 reward, and back in the 1950s, that was a lot of money to anybody that could successfully entice Little Tyke to eat some meat. And so many tried to claim this reward, but none were successful. In the meantime, to safeguard her health, they fed her on a double handful of cooked grains, chosen for their protein, calcium, fats and roughage, half a gallon of milk and 2 eggs per day. And she wasn't gnawing upon bones and other hard materials, so to safeguard the health of her teeth, they would give her a rubber gumboot with her favourite perfume sprinkled on it. And one gumboot would last for about a month. So time passed, and by the age of 4, she was 10 feet 4 inches long. She weighed 350 kilograms, 150 pounds. She could run at 40 miles an hour, 64 kilometres an hour. And according to one of America's most experienced zoo curators, she was the healthiest African lioness that he had ever seen. So at that point, they stopped worrying quite so much about the very scary messages that they were being given about what would happen to her health. However, that was just one case, and there are many other individual cases on the internet and in books about this topic. What about studies? Well, the first sort of larger scale study of the health of cats maintained on vegan or vegetarian diets was published in one of the world's top veterinary journals by a colleague of mine about 15 years ago. And she looked at more than 30 cats maintained on a vegetarian diet. Actually, all but 3 of these were vegan. The other 3 were fed partly on table scraps, which were not entirely vegan. And more than 50 cats maintained on a meat-based diet. And what the table is essentially telling us is summarised in the highlight at the bottom. There were no significant differences found in age, sex, body condition, housing, or perceived health status, with most cats being described as healthy or generally healthy. What about dogs? There was a study published in the British Journal of Nutrition in 2009. This is the first one that was published of a group of dogs looking at health outcomes. And these were 12 sprint racing Siberian Huskies. Now, I've thought about it, and I struggle to think of any dogs that would have higher nutritional needs other than perhaps early or late stage pregnancy or lactating, than dogs which are pulling sleds through snow for long distances under racing conditions for days and days on end. So these dogs had severe nutritional requirements. And these dogs were split into 2 groups of 6 each, and they maintained on either a commercial meat-based formulation or a vegetarian one formulated to the same nutrient specifications. They had blood tests and veterinary checks throughout. The blood results for all dogs were within normal range. They all showed an increase in red blood cell counts, and that was an adaptation to sustained exercise. It's an athletic adaptation that we see in human athletes as well. And all the dogs were assessed as being in excellent physical condition. In 2016, a colleague and I at the University of Winchester reviewed all the evidence available at that time about the health outcomes of cats and dogs, looking at these studies, looking at studies of the nutritional soundness or otherwise of plant-based diets and meat-based diets, and we published a review of all of this here, which has now been viewed almost 60,000 times, demonstrating, I think, how interesting this topic is seen as being. After looking at all that, we concluded this. Both cats and dogs may thrive on vegetarian and indeed, frankly, vegan diets, which means no animal products at all, but they must be nutritionally complete and balanced. And of course, if we think about it, dogs, cats, all species don't have requirements biologically for any particular ingredient, so they don't need meat. What they do have is biological requirements for sets of nutrients. And providing that we formulate diets to supply all the nutrients that they need, and that we formulate them in ways that are sufficiently palatable so the animals are happy to eat them, and that the diets are sufficiently bioavailable so they're adequately digestible, absorbable, can circulate around the bloodstream, get to the cells, get absorbed into the cells and be adequately utilised, then there's no scientific reason to expect that the animals would do worse on those diets. And that's what we seem to be seeing with the studies. What about bigger studies, really big studies? There haven't been any in cats or dogs until last March, when the first one of these was published by Sarah Dodd and colleagues from Guelph Vet School in Canada. And Dodd has just become the first veterinary nutritional specialist in the world to be specialising in this area, and her PhD was focused on this topic, and she just went through her PhD defence about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I had the privilege of being there and seeing the results of much of her research. So in this particular study, it was published in one of the world's top veterinary journals, there were 1,026 pet owners that gave sufficient information about the diets to be included in this study group, of which 187 of these cat owners were feeding vegan diets to their cats. And the key part is in red. Fewer cats fed plant-based diets were reported to have gastrointestinal or liver disorders. Cats fed plant-based, and by that she means vegan in this paper, were reported to have more ideal body condition scores. That's interesting because one of the most common health problems that cats have today is that they're becoming overweight and obese, so the vegan cats were less likely to be suffering from this. More owners of the plant-based cats reported their cat to be in very good health, and in all other health outcomes, there were no significant differences between the two groups. Certainly the vegan cats were not doing worse on any of the health outcomes that were studied. She asked about the lifespans of the previously owned cats, and here they are. The vegan ones were the greens, the meat-based ones are the reds, and the mixed diets were the orange. And it looks from that like the vegans are actually living longer. They're not. That difference is not statistically significant. Certainly they weren't living any less. Kind of following on from that, I did an even bigger study in 2019, and I surveyed more than 4,000 cat and dog owners, asking about the health and behavioural outcomes on different diets. And I want to firstly talk about the factors that were considered important to the pet guardians when choosing different pet foods, because it provides a bit of a structure that's really useful to present the results that follow. So firstly, I asked all of those that were feeding conventional meat or raw meat diets, would they be realistically willing to consider some kind of an alternative? And 54% said not, but 46%, nearly half, said yes, they would be willing to consider one of these alternative diets there. And they could select more than one choice, so they add up to more than 46. But you can see there laboratory-grown meat, vegetarian and vegan, insects, fungi, and so on. So I found that 46% of pet guardians were willing to consider alternatives to these meat-based diets. Dodd and colleagues published a survey of 3,600 pet guardians, so nearly as big, asking a similar question. And they found, and the key bit's the part in red, they found that 35% of people not already feeding a plant-based diet were interested in doing so if their key concerns were met. So they found 35, similar question, I found 46. My audience was primarily UK and European, hers was primarily Canadian and American. Interestingly, above that, you can see what the vegan pet guardians thought. 1/4 of them were currently feeding plant-based diets, but more than 3/4 of them would be interested in doing so if their key concerns were met. So what were the key concerns of all these people? I asked them what factors would they want to see satisfied by an alternative diet before they would consider it, and the factors are listed here. Confidence about pet health, nutritional soundness, a whole bunch of factors. And to make that easier to deal with, I've ranked the top 5 here in order. So concern about the health of their pets, nutritional soundness and quality of the diets, palatability, how much the animals enjoy eating the different diets, the environmental sustainability metrics of the different diets. Price came in at number 6, it didn't make it into the top 5. So what I've done in the rest of my research from this big survey of pet guardians, more than 4,000 pet guardians, about 2,500 dogs and nearly 1,500 cats, was I've asked them about the health outcomes and behavioural outcomes on different diets. I'm going to run you through some of those now. So with the dogs, I had enough in these 3 different dietary groups to do the sorts of statistical tests that we needed to do. So you can see 336 on maintained on vegan diets. The ages of these animals was broadly similar, as you can see there. It appears, but if you look a bit more closely, you can see there are differences. The vegan ones are the ones in green. They appear to be a bit older than the rest of the dogs. The dogs maintained on raw meat, the ones in orange, a bit younger. And that's relevant actually because we'll see often in the results that follow that these vegan and raw meat dogs get very similar health outcomes. But we know that being younger is quite often a health protective characteristic. Next, I asked them about a number of indications of general health status, and in fact 7 of those. I asked them about whether they had been seeing veterinarians an unusually high number of times in the last year. How many times did they see a vet? Because seeing a vet an unusually high number of times would be consistent with treatment for an ongoing healthcare problem, although sometimes there can be other reasons for that too. Were their animals on any kind of medication or not? Yes or no? Pretty objective question. After being on the vegan diet or the raw meat or the conventional meat, did they have to progress to going on to a medical diet? What was the reported healthcare assessment of their veterinarian about the health of those animals? What was their own opinion about the health of their animals? What proportion of these animals were unwell? And for the ones that were unwell, what was the average numbers of cases of disorder that they had? We also got data about the 22 most common health disorders in cats and dogs and the different prevalences of those across the different dietary groups. So if you look at the number of veterinary visits in the last year, and we're interested in the numbers that have had 2, 3 or more than 3 visits, the clusters of bars on the right-hand side, because that's a bit unusual most of the time. The normal recommendations are to see a veterinarian once within the last year for annual vaccinations and a general healthcare checkup. That's certainly the standard within the United Kingdom and other countries as well. So we're interested in animals that have been seeing a vet more than once. It looks like those clusters of bars are roughly the same. If we look a bit closer, there's something odd going on at the far left of that chart, however. The dogs on raw meat diets are seeing vets a lot less than the other groups, nearly half as often as the dogs on the other dietary groups. So I'll come back to that point later on, but that's something worth remembering. Let's have a look at medication use. If we look at the cluster on the right-hand side, the numbers that did use medications of any kind in the last year was significantly more for dogs maintained on conventional meat-based diets compared to the other 2 groups. Progressed to a therapeutic diet after being maintained on a vegan or one of the other diets. Hard to tell whether there are any differences there between the yes group. We've actually done the statistics and there are some differences and some are not statistically significant. The assessments of veterinarians, if we look at the cluster of bars on the left, that's the group that were reportedly assessed as being healthy, and then we have minor healthcare problems all the way up to serious healthcare problems on the right. You can see it looks like the vegans are being assessed as healthy more often than the other dietary groups. What about the opinions of the guardians themselves? And we get the same thing, except the raw meat and the vegans have become almost the same in this particular chart. What about the proportion of these animals that was suffering from one of the 22 most common disorders? The proportion of conventional meat animals that were unwell was 49%, raw meat 43%, and the vegans 36%. For those animals that were unwell, what was the average number of cases? Did they just have one disorder, or was it more than one kind of disorder at the same time in an animal? And you can see the average cases there. Conventional meat 1.65, raw meat and vegan very close together for that, but both of them less than the conventional meat diets. Now, which of those differences were statistically significant and which of them were just sort of random sampling variation but not really significant? Well, we did all the stats, and I'm not clever enough to do all this necessarily myself, so I've worked with statistical colleagues on these parts. And basically each one of these diets, say conventional meat, is being compared to the other two diets with respect to 7 different indicators of general health. So we've got 14 comparisons going on. So each of these columns should total to 14. And you can see that the conventional meat diet produces superior healthcare outcomes in 0 cases, equivalent in 3 and inferior in 11. So clearly they were less healthy, it seems, than the other 2 dietary groups. With the raw meat and the vegans, it looks like the raw meats might be marginally healthier than the vegans at first glance, but they look very, very similar actually. But remember, there was a couple of factors I asked you to think about with respect to the dogs on the raw meat diets. Confounding factors are things that might be distorting or changing the results other than the variable that we're intending to study, which is a different diet in this case. If we recall the ages of these animals, I said that the raw meat ones were younger overall than the dogs maintained on vegan diets, and animals that are younger are more likely to be generally healthy, so that might have been giving the raw meat dogs a bit of an advantage there. And the other factor was cultural factors. We know that the animals fed raw meat were were about twice as likely to not see a vet at all in the last year. And sure, that may be an indicator that they perhaps have better health, but it's also that they're not complying with general recommendations to see veterinarians on a regular basis. We know that most veterinarians are not approving of raw meat diets because there's a really substantial body of studies showing that raw meat diets have certain dietary hazards, imbalances and deficiencies of minerals and vitamins, bacterial and non-bacterial pathogens. There's quite a lot of studies that show that dogs fed raw meat have higher rates of diseases associated with bacterial pathogens, and also that the guardians of those dogs in those households also have higher rates of those diseases. So they're picking them up from their dogs or from the raw meat that they're preparing and giving to their dogs. Hence, there are pretty important protocols that need to be followed for people who are wanting to feed raw meat concerning hygiene in the kitchen, refrigeration, thawing, and being very careful around raw meat diets. And despite that, we have the studies showing that the rates of infection of people with these pathogens is much higher than normal. So because of these reasons, most veterinarians are quite disapproving of feeding raw meat diets to dogs. And we know from surveys that people who feed raw meat diets are more likely to get their information from non-veterinary sources, such as internet resources of variable reliability. So we think that there are probably cultural factors at work here, probably people who are feeding raw meat. We know that they're seeing veterinarians less often. It's probably because they feel a degree of disapproval from their veterinarians about their dietary choices, and they're getting their information from other sources. So that's a factor which is affecting the frequency of visits to veterinarians by guardians feeding raw meat, which is not just related to the health of those dogs. And that's affecting the first general healthcare indicator there. Now, if in order to receive medications to feed to animals, most of those come from veterinarians. And in order to receive therapeutic diets to maintain animals on, most of those are also dispensed by veterinarians. So the guardians that are seeing veterinarians less often are also likely to have altered parameters numbers 2 and 3. So actually, there's alterations going on in 1 through 3 out of 7 of these general healthcare indicators. So when you factor all that in, the ages and all those cultural factors that may be distorting those apparent healthcare outcomes for dogs fed raw meat, and you look at the marginal differences between the vegans and raw meats, it's hard to conclude whether the difference, apparent benefit to the raw meat dogs is real. I think it's quite clear that those dogs fed conventional meat are having general health outcomes which is less good than the other two groups. Between raw meat and vegans, they're very close. There may be factors giving the vegans a disadvantage compared to raw meats. Certainly, when you consider dietary hazards, not just health but also dietary hazards, it's quite clear that there's major risks of those associated with raw meat diets, but there are not those same pathogen hazards associated with vegan diets. So I think it's a correct conclusion to assert that the healthiest and least hazardous dietary choices for dogs are vegan diets. We looked at the 22 specific healthcare disorders that were most common, and we looked at the prevalence of those disorders in those 3 different dietary groups. And you can see the most common is gastrointestinal, followed by skin and coat, other musculoskeletal, and so on. And if you look at those clusters, it looks like in some cases there are some real differences going on there. Gastrointestinal at the top, you can see it appears to be about twice as prevalent in animals fed conventional meat compared to dogs fed raw or vegan, for example. And looking at the lot of them, as you can see, probabilities appeared to be highest of suffering from one of those 22 disorders. Meat-based dogs 11 times, conventional meat 11 times, raw meat 8 times, and vegan dogs 3 times, actually. Now, some of those are statistically significant and some aren't. And the results will be in our forthcoming publication on this, which is coming out this year. So what about the cats? And this is where it gets even more interesting, because we know just the way that people knew once that the world was flat or that the Earth was the centre of the solar system. We know, many of us think we know, that cats cannot possibly be healthy on a vegan diet. And I showed you the results of the Wakefield study of around about 80 or so cats, giving us apparently a contrary result to that. So here we have a study of 1369 cats, and of course there's also been the Dodd study of 1,026 cats, of which 187 were vegan. In this case, there weren't enough cats being fed raw meat to do these sort of statistical comparisons that we wanted. So we compared the vegans, 127 just on vegan diets, with those on the meat-based diets. And if you look at unusually high number of veterinary visits, the 3 clusters on the right-hand side, it looks like maybe the vegans are a little bit less commonly seeing the vets an unusually high number of times. The ones that were on medication, it looks like the vegans had less medication use, less progression onto a therapeutic diet after being maintained on their initial diet. If you look at the group that are reportedly considered by vets to be healthy, the vegans were more likely to be reported to be considered healthy. What about the guardians' own opinions? They were certainly more likely to consider them to be healthy if they were on a vegan diet. The proportion of cats overall that were unwell, 42% for the meat-based ones, 37% for the vegans. The average cases of disorder, and I would stop here and say that all of those previous results, to our disappointment, were not statistically significant. So we went all the way through to number 7. This is the last one. And finally, we got a result that was statistically significant. So cats who are unwell are more likely to have a higher number of disorders, it seems, if they are on meat-based diets compared to being on a vegan diet. When you look at that, it's marginal because we only had one result that was statistically significant. In all other cases, the apparent benefits for the vegans was not actually statistically significant, but it seems that overall the vegan cats were healthier than the meat-based cats. What about the 22 specific disorders? They're a different group because cats suffer from slightly different disorders. So now we're looking at the most common one being dental oral, and for those of you in veterinary practice, you'll well be aware of the prevalence of this as a healthcare problem, followed by body weight, number 2, gastrointestinal, number 3, and so on. And we had the probabilities of suffering from one of these was highest in the meat-based cats 15 times and highest in the vegan cats 7 times. Disappointingly, none of these were statistically significant, and the reason for that was because the number of vegans suffering from each one of these 22 disorders, when we constructed the table and had all those cells with the numbers in them, the number of vegans in those cells was so low, the number of vegans suffering from those individual disorders was so low that there was not statistical significance happening with our group of just 127 vegan cats overall. Dot, of course, had 187 vegan cats in her study group, and she did find statistically significant benefits for the vegan cats, gastrointestinal, liver, and a couple of other aspects as well, I think. So I strongly suspect that if we didn't have 127, but we had double or triple the number of vegan cats, actually a lot of these would come up as being statistically significant, but they weren't in our sample group. So if we look at the evidence coming out of the large-scale studies, they do actually support the feeding of nutritionally sound vegan diets to cats and dogs. That's the top concern that our consumers said that they had about considering an alternate type of a diet to a meat-based diet. The next concerns were nutritional soundness and quality of the diets. And I only have one slide on all of this. We conducted another study actually of the manufacturers of pet foods. We surveyed 19 manufacturing meat-based and 10 manufacturing plant-based diets. And we looked at every stage during the process from initial design of the formulation, the level of expertise that was being used, were they using a veterinary nutritional specialist, a PhD nutritionist, or some level of expertise to formulate these diets? How were they taking steps to ensure that the diet was nutritionally sound? Were they simply formulating it to comply with the nutritional guidelines of European or US authorities? Were they conducting feeding trials? Were they maintaining these animals on that diet as their sole nutrient intake for a 6-month period in a controlled facility like a laboratory and assessing the animals at the end of it? What about ensuring the quality of the ingredients? Were they relying upon written agreements with suppliers? Were they going out and physically inspecting plants? Were they supplementing with all the sorts of nutrients that were needed to ensure that the diets had all of those nutrients? And that applies to certainly the vegan diets, which wouldn't naturally have all the nutrients that these animals need, and to the meat-based diets, where they might have those nutrients to start with, but fragile nutrients such as taurine and some vitamins can be degraded substantially, virtually destroyed by the high temperatures and other treatments during the processing of these pet foods, so they need to be added back in afterwards. What about the methods used to preserve these pet foods to ensure the quality of them and to prevent colonisation by bacteria, moulds, and so on? Were they monitoring to look at the degradation of nutrients over time, the loss of biological activity of fragile nutrients, particularly vitamins, maybe amino acids? Were they actually oversupplying any of those nutrients to take account of degradation over time? And finally, did they have reasonable protocols for the storage and shipping of their products to try to ensure the nutritional soundness and quality that they were giving, that they were following themselves, they were giving to retailers, they were making available to consumers of those diets? And when we looked at all of that, we saw that generally most of those companies were doing things pretty well. They're pretty good standards across the sector. Overall, the plant-based manufacturers were slightly better than the ones producing the meat-based diets. They certainly weren't overall doing worse. And we published that earlier last year. So that takes into account really in a single slide of those two concerns numbers 2 and 3 that the consumers said they had. What about palatability, the extent to which the animals actually like eating their foods? And this is a big concern to many people. It's often asserted that forcing cats and dogs to consume plant-based diets is somehow cruel or a violation of their welfare. To address this point, Jed Gillen, in his book Obligate Carnivore, says, for those of you at least living near a beach, you can try this experiment at home. skip your cat's breakfast one morning. Instead, take him or her down to the beach, place him on the beach and observe. Stop and see whether natural instincts will kick in, whether your cat will dive into the waves, swim 50 or so miles out in the deep ocean, engage an adult tuna fish weighing about 3/4 of a tonne, the size of a small horse, in an underwater battle to the death to fulfil the natural, the highly motivated feline behavioural urge to eat tuna fish, which of course is an ingredient within cat food. So he's making the point that actually a lot of what we think is natural, that we're feeding to cats and dogs, is actually a mixture of assorted body parts from animals they would never naturally consume. We're talking about cows, sheep, pigs, fish. And if we consider that we're feeding these assorted miscellaneous body parts with a whole range of unnatural additives to cats and dogs at predictable times daily, packaged up as dry kibble or as tinned diets, and we think about what really is a natural feeding regime for an ancestral dog or a cat, we realise that actually what we're already feeding a lot of the time might not be very natural either. And it's interesting that so many people have a very strong reaction to the idea of not feeding one unnatural diet, but instead feeding another unnatural diet, and this time we're using plants. They have a very strong reaction against that, asserting that it's cruel to do that, and yet they don't have a very strong reaction against deworming, defleeing, desexing, microchipping, vaccinating, confining animals indoors at night, because we quite rightly understand that these sorts of steps are important parts of responsible pet guardianship and help safeguard the welfare of these animals. So why is there a strong reaction to doing one unnatural thing, but there isn't to a bunch of other unnatural things? I think it's probably because there's been such a polarised social debate about vegan diets in particular, and that has resulted in a very strong reaction which is not logically consistent. More importantly than what people think and why they think the way they do, what do the animals think about these different diets? Of course, we can't just ask the animals. Many of us have probably tried it. It doesn't get you too far. What we can do is we can observe the behaviour of the animals closely and analyse it statistically to the nth degree, as we've done. Again, not myself, I'm not that clever, my colleagues. And so we looked at 2,300 dog owners, gave us information about the behaviour of their animals when they're fed their normal diets, meat-based or plant-based or whatever. And we looked through the literature and found all these indicators of palatability when dogs are fed different diets. The first thing we did was we went and analysed which of those co-varied together with one another, how likely were all these dogs to engage in all these different behaviours, the people told us that, and then we looked at which of them co-varied with one another and how consistent that was with previous literature, and on that basis we were able to identify 9 of these as positive indicators and 1 as a negative indicator of palatability, and you'll recognise many of these, those of you who have dogs yourself. We then looked at how these varied across the 3 different diets. And we found this: there was reliable evidence statistically of increased appetitive behaviour by dogs on raw meat compared to conventional, but no consistent evidence of a difference between vegan and either of the other meat-based diets. So as far as you can tell from detailed study of thousands of these dogs, when you look at their behaviour, they appear to be enjoying their vegan food as much as the raw meat or the conventional meat-based diets. That's the best I think we can do unless we do work out how to talk to them. What about cats? In this case, we had enough animals in these 3 dietary groups to do the kind of statistical tests we needed to do. There were 15 indicators of palatability that we found by looking through all the palatability literature. We analysed them. We were able to identify 5 as positive, 4 as negative, and 6 we couldn't confidently identify as being either positive or negative indicators of palatability. And then we looked at how those varied on the 3 different diets, and we found this. Cats on vegan diets were reported as licking their food less often. Now, that's a negative indicator, so they did this negative indicator less often than cats on conventional meat and raw meat. Cats on conventional meat were more likely to leave their food unfinished. That's a negative indicator. So conventional had this negative indicator compared to raw meat. But overall, there was little difference, to be honest. There were 15 indicators, and we only found differences in that tiny number. Overall, the diets made little difference. So again, there's no clear evidence when you look at the evidence that these animals are somehow suffering. They're showing behaviour indicating that they're not enjoying their food as much if they're being fed vegan diets. This is what we concluded, results from our study, which also can concur, by the way, with other studies with much smaller study numbers than we had, but nevertheless concur with those studies. Vegan pet food does not generally result in reduced palatability and doesn't compromise the welfare of cats in this manner. So we published that last year. So that's almost all of the concerns that the consumers had, and we're down to the last of the top 5, environmental sustainability. And you would have gotten a lot of this from Professor Bridle, the previous speaker, and there have been a slew of studies looking at the environmental impacts of the food production system. One of the most important has been recently published in Nature Food, but essentially, here's a quick summary. We know that about a third of all greenhouse gas emissions globally are attributable to food production, and the livestock sector contributes about 20% of all greenhouse gases globally. Now, if we look at the amount of carbon dioxide that we are able to emit as globally, as a society, between now and the end of the century, and if we want to keep the Earth's average surface temperature just 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, then we're looking at the orange 2 bars in the middle. If we want to have a 67% chance of keeping the global temperature to that level, we can afford to emit 500 gigatons of carbon dioxide between now and the end of the century. If we want to have a 50% chance, then it's 7.5 gigatons. At this level, we're expecting very severe climate change effects globally, and many of you will know all about that. If we want to keep things to a 2-degree rise, which has been thought by many to be a tipping point beyond which positive feedback events in the Arctic and other regions of the world are thought to have a real risk of runaway climate change, then we can afford to emit these amounts of carbon here. Now, if we continue with the food system under the business as usual model, doing things the way that we have done, the amount of carbon we're going to emit just in the food system is going to destroy any realistic chance of us being able to meet the 1.5 degree above pre-industrial levels. And it also seriously jeopardise our chances of maintaining things at 2 degrees above previous pre-industrial levels as well. So something really has to change. As I said, there have been a slew of studies demonstrating that some kind of transition to a plant-based diet is likely to radically decrease the amount of greenhouse gases and other environmental metrics produced by the food system. This has just been published in Nature Food, and it showed that the greenhouse gas emissions of animal-based foods on average are twice as much as those of plant-based foods. Because of so many studies showing these sorts of results, the Eat Lancet committee of more than 35 leading scientists got together to produce a detailed report to look at what we would need to do to our consumption of livestock products and other food products in order to be able to feed 10 billion people in the future in a sustainable way within planetary boundaries. And they concluded that we would be able to eat this many kilograms per person per year of meat, milk and dairy, eggs, and fish and seafood. That's the middle column there. ProVeg International has also published a report calling for a 50% reduction, as many others have as well, by 2040. And in order to achieve that, they've calculated a very similar range of metrics in most cases. Compare that to the current consumption of animal produce in the left-hand column. And you can see that really quite radical reductions are required in most of those categories for us to have any chance, I think, of being able to sustainably feed 10 billion people in the future within planetary boundaries. So these sorts of concerns are, have become widely known and cause us to reconsider the food production system for people. But what about for pets? Nobody's really looked at this until just recently. And one of the first papers was published by Ocken in 2017 in PLOS 1, and he actually calculated the environmental impacts attributable to pet food in the United States, which is the country with the single largest population of cats and dogs in the world, about 160 million, and also the most comprehensive range of data. So he calculated that 25 to 30% of the environmental impacts of the livestock sector are due to pet food. So that's 25 to 30% of the land use, water, fossil fuels, phosphates, pesticides, and also that there is an awful lot of greenhouse gases attributable to pet food. If we take he said 25 to 30% of the livestock impacts attributable to pet food. If we take the bottom end, let's take 25%, and we apply that to what we already know, that overall greenhouse gas emissions from the livestock sector contribute 20% of all human-generated greenhouse gas emissions. That would mean, if a quarter of that is due to pet food, that would mean that we're talking about 5% of greenhouse gas emissions globally just due to the pet food sector. So the interesting question then arises, what would the difference be if, let's say, the world's cats and dogs were transitioned onto vegan diets, or all of America's, or all of the United Kingdom cats and dogs, or some 50-50 vegan or meat-based, or some other combination? What would the benefits be? And it's been impossible to really calculate this until just recently. And I have had a bit of a breakthrough because I've figured out a way to do it. What you need to do is you need to look at pet food, and you firstly need to work out how much of the food energy in pet food comes from animal sources and how much comes from non-animal sources such as plants, because there's a lot of that just in conventional meat-based pet food. But beyond that, you will need to look at the animal fraction, and you need to work out how much of that is due to byproducts from the human food production system, and how much of that is not byproducts, is actually due to essentially growing animals for direct consumption by pets. And it hasn't really been possible to do the second part until just recently because there's been no good data. But I've just managed to crack this really difficult problem. And once you can do that, you can then unlock all the rest of this. So I've looked at America so far, and I've been able to calculate that if all of America's cats and dogs were transitioned onto vegan pet food, you would have enough food energy saved to be able to feed tens of millions of extra Americans. It's a small but significant proportion of the entire US population of people. You would save more than 1 billion land animals each year from being slaughtered. You would save very large amounts of land, water, pesticides, fertilizers, and a large amount of greenhouse gases as well. And those results will be coming out this year as well when they're published in due course. So that's the top concerns that consumers have had. And if we remember that this very rapid rate of growth of the alternative, in fact the vegan pet food sector, is already underway. This is the way the chart's looking prior to all this new evidence coming out. That was prior to the Dodd study, which has only just come out in March last year, and all the other large-scale studies that are just starting to come and will be coming this year. So I think once that information gets out there, this curve is going to take off even more quickly, to be honest. So I guess in my closing words, I would say, should cats and dogs go vegan? I would say absolutely, for all of those reasons, in order to provide them with health that's at least as good and possibly in some respects better than cats and dogs on meat-based diets, because they're just as happy as far as we can tell on these diets, and because there's really significant environmental benefits of transitioning them onto vegan diets. But the diets have to be formulated to be nutritionally complete and balanced. They must be nutritionally sound. You can't just go home and randomly toss together a bunch of fruit and vegetables and hope that your cat or dog is going to be fine. They won't be. It is possible to add nutritional supplements into homemade diets and try and do it that way. Unfortunately, that's pretty difficult to get right, and there have been studies showing that even veterinary nutritionists that do this quite often produce formulations which are nutritionally not quite right. And it's certainly not something that is easy to do if you are not a veterinary nutritionist, I would say. I suppose it is easy. You can follow a recipe that the supplier companies provide you. I tried this once. I made some kibble, cooked it in the oven and ate it myself, and it wasn't too bad, I have to say, but I don't recommend it as a general rule. So it's much better to go with a reputable pet food manufacturer that has formulated a diet that's intended to be nutritionally complete and balanced for these species and perhaps the life stage for which it's intended. How do you do this? You look for companies that are working with veterinary nutritionists. You look at the labelling claims to see whether it is being formulated to be nutritionally complete and balanced. You look to see whether they have any evidence of independent laboratory testing confirming that their diet does actually supply all the nutrients that it should be doing. You might have a red flag coming up if they refuse to answer any of your questions. You use your judgment and your common sense. But as you can see from the studies, overall there are no indications that animals maintained on these diets have any worse health, and indeed probably they have health that's actually better in some respects. For those who are interested in transitioning their animals onto nutritionally sound vegan diets, there are some things that can be done to ease the transition. Any of you who've got old cats may know that they can be particularly stubborn sometimes about after being maintained on their preferred diet for a lot of their lifetimes about transitioning onto anything else. And that's because of the flavour enhancers which are put into those diets by the manufacturers. Same thing can happen to dogs as well. I don't want to be speciesist here, but I've had experience with old cats. Anyway, there are things you can do to natural additives to make the diets more tasty, and also a gradual transition can help with allowing the digestive enzymes to transition and the bacteria within the gut to transition as well. So I've got all that advice along with these studies as they have been published and as they are becoming available on my website, sustainablepetfood.info. I would like to acknowledge all of the very clever people who have helped me with this work. As I say, I'm not really a statistician myself. I've been assisted by a bunch of colleagues at Winchester who are, and also in Queensland as co-authors of these studies. I always am grateful to the supporters who've made it possible for me to be doing this research. I come from a fairly teaching-intensive university where there's not very much time to actually do any research, and I'm supposed to really not be getting this involved in any of this. I should be marking assignments and teaching all of the time, pretty much. And I can only actually get to do all this if I do receive external funding to allow me to hire other colleagues to do those things. So I'm very grateful to Food Awareness Organisation, Providence International, and these pet food companies here, Wild Earth in the US and Edgar Cooper in Europe, who are on the leading edge of trying to develop more sustainable pet foods. Also grateful to everyone who helped me reach more than 4,000 pet owners. I have to say that on Facebook I don't have 4,000 friends, and there's no way I could have reached so many people and encouraged them to participate in this survey to find out about health outcomes and behavioural outcomes without a whole lot of help getting out to so many different people. So I'm very grateful to them as well. So I hope that that's been interesting, and thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. That really was a fascinating talk. Another star performance in this series. You began with some sobering facts driving our choices as to why we need to, as humans, move to plant-based lifestyles. And then I think you've given us really compelling evidence-based analysis of how that can be done for cats and dogs and why it is acceptable to these animals, apparently, and that it's good for their health and welfare. And you've also shown all of us the benefits that will deliver to the planet. So for me, that does beg the question, can we and should we be learning from our pets rather than them learning from us as to what we eat and our lifestyles? That's one to discuss over dinner for those who can. And look more perhaps at the behaviour of the guardians of pets. But I want to just conclude by saying thank you to Andrew. Thank you all for joining us online and here. Please do come again next week for Sarah Mukherjee's lecture on food, power and society. But in the meantime, if you have missed last week's lecture by Sarah or indeed some of Andrew's this week, do go to the YouTube, the college YouTube website, where you can hear it all again. So please join me again in saying very many thanks to Andrew Knight for such an informative break.